All right, hello everybody and welcome to Facilitating XYZ Live. My name is Sam Killermann and I'm one of the co-hosts of this show. I'm one of the co-facilitators of Facilitating XYZ. Facilitating XYZ is a free online resource for all facilitators, and this show is part of that resource where we spend some time with a facilitator we admire and ask them questions with the hope of learning some things to improve our facilitation and, with any luck, things that will benefit all facilitators. So with that said, our guest today is Jamie Washington, who will introduce himself in a little bit. But first, Meg, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, all right. Hello, everyone. My name is Meg Bolger. I'm one of the other co-facilitators of Facilitating XYZ and co-host of this show. And I'm so excited to be talking to Jamie today. I've had the pleasure of being a participant to Jamie's facilitation, I think twice in two different contexts and on two different sides of the country. Once in Connecticut and once in California, I think. So it's so cool to be able to dig into the magic that I saw and get to ask you questions I might have had, even if I was supposed to have my participant hat on in that moment. So excited to get into that. Jamie, if you would mind just kind of introducing yourself to those who don't know you, and we'll start there.
Great. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for Meg and Sam for this opportunity to have this conversation. When getting the invitation, it just gave me such excitement because it, again, is what I enjoy doing very much in the world. And partially that is because I find that the role of facilitator as educator and as activist is a powerful transformational opportunity, and what I think of often is a noble calling to help folks engage in important and difficult conversations and deep learnings and coming to new knowings about themselves and other things. I have been doing facilitation for probably over 30 some odd years now. I started out, I remember my first facilitation session was as an RA at Slippery Rock State College back in the in the early 80s, when I was an RA facilitating a workshop on sexuality on my residence halls. And so since that time, I have worked with lots of different groups and organizations and communities and in several different contexts, everywhere from higher education to corporate America to religious institutions to nonprofits, all in the hopes of helping folks to come together to do learning through not just telling, but through engagement. And so I can talk more about all the different ways that happens, but we'll do that as some of the questions come up, and I'll share some context in which I've done some things.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Your first workshop you facilitated was on sexuality?
It was.
Dang, that is quite quite the leap. I want to jump into that, but first, I want to make sure we talk about that later. But first, I'd like to hear if you'd be comfortable sharing any experiences that led to you being an RA or facilitating that workshop, like about your childhood, about high school, like any things that pop up that you think would be salient that led to you landing in that spot.
Well, I was active as a leader, active as a leader within my faith community and my church growing up, and active as a theater person in high school. And so in all of those spaces, those were just kind of opportunities for me to kind of be up in front of people and to be with people. I am one of my strengths, if you've ever done Strength Finder or Strength Quest information, one of my strengths is learner, and one of my greatest strengths is learner, communicator, and connectedness. And so all of those lend to being strong in facilitation skills. And so as an RA, I had gone to RA trainings and participated in leadership workshops and so on, and saw what folks did, and thought I saw some good stuff and saw some stuff that I felt like I could do and add some things to. And so we had the opportunity as RAs to do programs in the residence halls. And so there wasn't a whole lot of, we didn't have a whole lot of resources back then. So, you know, we might have had, you know, some other hall directors or maybe someone in student life or student activities, but lots of the conversations and things were happening and programs were happening with the RAs. I had been a peer educator, and in my peer education training, we were learning to facilitate dialogues with students, with our other students. And so that was probably the thing that sparked and got me into. And so I was loved being with people and loved asking good questions. And it wasn't actually until I got to seminary, some many years later, that I learned that asking good questions really is a part of my theological training and my religious upbringing. And so as I think back to lots of the teachings in Christendom of Jesus, he asked good questions to lead people to find their knowings and their answers around things. So facilitation is just an extension of that for me, to invite folks into find their own knowings around things.
So Jamie, a lot of your that was awesome, like to know kind of where you were coming from, and a lot of that, what struck me, like, so the RA training and the peer facilitator training, is that you actually had some kind of formal training in facilitation. Can you speak to like anything you remember about those early kind of like being introduced to like how to work with a group or how to work with your peers?
Sure. So lots of the early trainings that I was involved in was a lot about inviting folks in to explore values, right? And so what mattered to them. So I would be in RA trainings and we would be doing values clarification exercises and activities that would help us to get clearer about what we valued, what was important, what made sense to us. We also did in that counseling and helping skills, which was about being present with other people and active listening and doing reflecting back and summarizing what we've heard. So those critical foundation counseling-based skills were also very useful and important in terms of the ability to facilitate. So I think for me, there is this kind of combination of content area knowledge, right, about particular topics, alongside of human relations knowledge in terms of how to be with people, as well as how to counseling-based knowledge is that's connected to how to help people to explore and define, and depending upon the content, deeper and sometimes more, if you will, more controversial or more topics that's going to make people feel more vulnerable, right? Engage people in a more vulnerable kind of exploration and engagement. So as I think about all three of those different kinds of areas, some of the stuff that I learned was in each of those pockets.
Sounds great. It's sounds like a lot more both breadth and depth than a lot of people get in facilitator training. So many people are just given a packet, right, and told to dive in. Jimmy, I'm curious, when did you start? So when you introduced yourself, you mentioned yourself as facilitation is helpful both as educator and activist. When did you start seeing yourself as an activist or start doing activist work? Was this about the same time, or was it before or after?
So then the content that I delved more deeply into was content that focused on advocacy and helping folks to learn more about themselves, others, and how to be in community with others. So I began to see myself as activist as I could see the change that would happen as a result of good facilitation. So that there is this notion that, so there's a way to be an activist or a change agent. And I would argue that there are multiple ways in order to do that. And one of the primary ways that I show up is as facilitator, educator, activist, such that I'm able to be in, whether that is facilitating a conversation at a meeting or doing facilitation in a training mode. Both of those are opportunities to actually show up with a goal of helping to create change, right? And that's what I think about activism. It is about creating change and making better, right? And so there is a particular hoped for end goal, while that in facilitation, it is not determined. So in my facilitation, I don't have, by the end of this session, I have to be here. It's by the end of the session, we have to have done this, right? And so it's the process that's important in terms of the facilitation work.
Cool.
I think that last thing you said of like, we don't have to be here, we have to have done this. Mm-hmm. I think that's so powerful and also really challenging, like, and intimidating, I think, especially when you start, right? Like having like, we will like kind of predictable learning outcomes, right? It is much, it's less intimidating, I think, both.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And for the people on the other side of that. Yes. Is there anything that comes to mind for you, like around when you started getting comfortable with that space, or getting comfortable with that, like, we're not going to necessarily do these things, like, or be at this place. We're just going to have done this experience together. Like, can you remember when you started realizing, like, oh, that's what this is all about, and kind of how that came to be?
Yeah, I think that it became clear. I had the benefit, and I must own, I really did have great mentors. Dr. Joan Lester and Carol Johnson and Yeshe Sherova Newman, all of us worked together at Equity Institute that was founded actually in Massachusetts and then moved to the Bay Area. And in its later iteration became the Equity Consulting Group. And I served as a senior consultant with the group and still am on the books as a senior consultant with the group. Don't have as much time to do the work with them, but my foundation in terms of really doing in-depth facilitation, where I began to get comfortable with, we will do this, not necessarily be at a specific place, was in that group. We would do 5-day train the trainer programs, and weekend-long empowerment programs. And so back in the late 80s, we would come together with folks in from lots of different areas, sometimes education, K through 12, and higher education, as well as nonprofits and businesses. We'd come together, and again, with the intention of doing deepening and building capacity for folks to facilitate more effectively within and across difference. Those workshops were designed to have people be in process, as well as develop the tools and the skills to navigate and facilitate the conversations and the workshops effectively. And in those spaces is where I got really comfortable with, maybe it's more the learning is there's content in the process, right? And so there's learning that's happening about how we get there and what it means to be there and how we live there together, that is as important as whatever the there is, right? So that it was very significant. And then I continued doing work in that space, and that was late 80s, early 90s. And then I began to work with, and Kathy O'Bear and I worked together with LCY Cross and Associates, which is another consulting group that had been doing much of its work in corporate America. And so again, navigating the conversations and building the capacity to not only do the facilitation in the spirit of self and building capacity, but also doing the work with an intention to help folks understand the business case for the work. Why is it that we, whatever the content is, understanding that it must be connected to something. And as a result, that folks bring themselves into it with an understanding that in order for them to do what they're called to do, what the mission of the place is or the organization is, that they must have these skills and these abilities in order to do that. And so to have that as a backdrop and a framework that was, I felt, an add-on to the work that I had been doing, which was much more about it's the right thing to do from a social justice perspective. I don't know that when I was doing some of the work prior to getting with LCY Cross, that I often brought the lens of the business case for doing the work. And I think that today, as I engage the work with a heart grounding in it being the right thing to do and a core value about that, I'm also very clear about why this matters in terms of the world we're trying to create, why it matters in terms of healthcare, why it matters in terms of education, why it matters in terms of the legal system, why it matters in terms of parenting, why it matters in terms of religious organizations. So helping folks to move into the facilitation with a clearer understanding of why does this matter to the audience that you're engaging.
Did you experience like internal resistance to that idea of trying to, yeah? Talk about that?
Yes, yes, that's great. That's great. Because entering lots of this work from the place of entering my primary facilitation. So that first workshop around sexuality that I did was about creating more inclusive and welcoming places across sexual orientation. That's what it was about.
Because
right?
it's good to do that because you should, right?
That's right, exactly, and that's where it came from, and lots of the work that I did at Indiana and beyond that was about it being what good people do, right? That's why you should do it, and so it was from a social justice activist, if you would, lens that I was grounded in the work. As I got into the clarity around how we move these conversations beyond just the people who care about it, right? Into recognizing that this is the work that we all need to do. And just because folks don't care about it doesn't mean they really don't. They may not know to care about it. They don't know why they should care or why it should matter to them. And so just because they don't know that doesn't mean that they can't know it. And creating space for them to be able to learn that and engage in that was so important. And I initially did find myself in, and still find myself with people who struggle with the engagement of the work of the facilitation around diversity and inclusion, social justice with a business case framework. That feels somehow, what I often hear folks says, that it's about what's in it for them. It's not about, it's the right thing to do, right? So if you have that business case, if you would, as the backdrop, then sometimes it feels like, well, they're only connected to it because of the bottom line, or only connected to it because of the changing demographic, or they're going to lose accreditation, and all of these things. And I think that some of that might be what we need to get some people to the table. And my hope is that what we do find in those spaces is people's humanity that has them stay. The business case will get you in it. Your humanity is what keeps you in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was striking me when you're talking, Jamie, was that that seems like a both and. So as facilitators, right? We are constantly having to be. We constantly know we have to hold a both and, not an either or.
Yep.
And that allows that cognitive complexity of like, we can have a business case and know it's the right thing to do.
That's right.
Right?
Absolutely.
Are there other things that you think you like? So for me, that's like a belief I have as a facilitator, but it also translates way beyond.
Yes.
Like, it also allows me to do very cognitively complex or hold a lot of complexity around this work. Is there anything else that jumps to mind for you of like, this is something I believe as a facilitator, but I also see it allowing me to do the work that I'm doing as a facilitator. Like, it serves me in both those spaces.
Yes. Well, I appreciate your naming, Meg, the both and, right? And that, again, is a framework and a mindset and a concept that I embody. And I don't think that I began to fully embody that until, again, the early 90s when I started working with LC White Cross. It was one of the foundational concepts that we offered. It was not either or, but both and. And it really has shifted, you know, my life for the last 30 years, right? In terms of everything, the ability to hold multiple truths, right? And multiple competing priorities and the complexities of things, right? So absolutely that. And I think that is critical for us as facilitators, those who want to kind of be in spaces and navigate the importance of holding this perspective that is yours and facilitating a perspective that is different than yours with folks in the room who might see it somewhat differently. The other things and that I hold as an important piece that I'm working often with in facilitation is the notion of intent and impact. And that's particularly doing facilitation around diversity, inclusion, social justice work, that dynamic of being in spaces where folks will say something because you ask the question and they tell you the truth, that their response may have an impact differently than they intended or that you expected, right? So, and in that space, your ability to hold intent and impact, to explore the impact, to not need to focus on intent, but to trust intent, to figure out the time when maybe intent is useful to explore, but to know that it's not always the space given the dynamic, right? Understanding the dynamics of particular privileged and marginalized groups that then invites us in to know which piece of this we need to explore. Should we explore this now? Should we not do anything with it, but just hold the notion that we're having an intent and impact moment and allow folks just to kind of sit with the messiness of that is another key and critical framework for me. The other big one, and most folks who have heard me speak, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years, my mentor, one of my mentors in my doctoral program, Dr. Michael Suje, who was he was at University of Maryland, but then went on to be a professor at Louisville, taught me the importance of context before content. And in the teaching of that, I got clear about how important that understanding was as I did facilitation. I feel like often around facilitation, whether that is about social justice or diversity issues or anything, that we can err if we go to the content too fast, not recognizing the importance of assessing our context before we move into the space is an absolute mistake that lots of folks make. So, okay, so I got this content. The content that I am supposed to deliver is the new internet, the new technology program for the campus. That's the content that I'm supposed to deliver. Okay, so I'm facilitating that new learning. So I need to ask the question, what's the context that I'm doing that in? So what's informing the context? Is the context, this is the, everybody's excited because we got a whole new system and we've needed it for 30 years, and is that it? Or is the context informed by, there's a new vice president for technology and they're coming in and they're throwing up and changing everything, and nobody wanted to hire that person anyway. That's the one that we did, and they're kind of changing. All of that informs how you show up to facilitate the conversation, and what might come at you and what you might have to hold, and how you want to navigate that at the beginning, right before you even move into it. That gets upped as we're beginning to talk about human dynamic issues. So you're talking about an issue around race or gender or sexual orientation or gender identity or religion, and an incident has just occurred on your campus or in your organization, that context is different than having the conversation in simply a value-based space. Yep. Facilitating that conversation, a value-based, it's very different. Yeah. So context before content is foundational.
Yeah, I laugh because it's rarely, when we don't know the context, is it the ideal context, right? Rarely are we so fortunate that everyone's so excited to be having the conversation that to have, right?
Exactly.
Oh, it's so important. So Jimmy, I want to like rewind back to that first. So the both, you went from both and into the
intent.
Yep, intent and impact. So both and, something that I think a lot of facilitators struggle with, and this would be in all contexts, but really especially in social justice context, is holding space for multiple truths, or more importantly, helping participants hold space for multiple truths, right? You'll have one participant who says, this is true, and somebody else who says, no, this is true. And maybe as a facilitator, you're like, that person's right, but that's not really my role here. What advice would you have for people who are trying to help participants hold multiple truths, or see that both and, when participants keep trying to collapse the conversation into a single reality?
Sure. So one of the things that's important in terms of when we're working with students is understanding cognitive developmental knowing, right? And so that if you're working with a group of students who might be in dualism and either or, right or wrong, black or white, then those students are going to have a different road up to being able to hold multiplicity and relativism. They're just going to be a slower walk, right? You've got to ask different kinds of questions and be with them in different ways. If you're working with students who are able to hold complexity and are able to navigate kind of the both and they're just grounded in a space because of their core value, they're digging in because they believe this is more right? That's very different than folks who only see one, it's either or, right? So so just kind of listening, paying attention to, so I'm often, as I'm trying to help students hold multiple truths, I ask them, just say more of how you come to that. What's that about for you, right? What are you feeling under there? Because some of the space is needed for folks to just be able to name what they're feeling, because they're feeling angry, frustrated, disappointed, disillusioned, all of those things. And you're feeling that because every time we come to this conversation, or it never seems like this, and let people really fully be heard is a part of the work that's needed to be done kind of in that space. And the other part to that, Sam, I would say, is that you must start with these notions. So when you're starting any kind of conversation around social justice, you have to create the learning community. And that space has to be created with a knowing that we're going to, the desire to be open to multiple perspectives, to new perspectives, different than your own. And then you invite the room into, so which ones of these are going to be hard for you, right? Yeah. Which ones of these are going to be a stretch for you? And we are going to ask you today to stretch, right? So those are up, or need to, that we're going to try to operate out of these today. And so when we have a moment where it feels like folks are not being able to hold multiple perspectives, again, we get to remind them. So we talked about as we started that this might be one of those places we're going to stretch it, right? And to invite you just to hold, what would it mean if that perspective were true?
Yeah.
How do you hold if that perspective were true? How do you hold if that perspective were true, right? And, you know, just kind of to be with people around. How many of you have been in spaces where there have been more than one truth, one way that people have seen it and experienced it, and therefore making it that? Now, again, inviting folks into the distinction between perspectives and experiences, and to the extent at which we can hold facts, right? Like, simply, that's not true. That is not how that happened, right? And so what's your investment in holding on to this is a part of the kind of engagement and questioning space. So, you know, sometimes there is, you know, there's just missing information and biased history, right? That's a part of oppression. That's how that stays alive and well. And so to introduce, for instance, to folks some historical facts around things that they didn't know or that's been left out, and they say, well, no, this is who, no, that's actually not accurate, right? And this is where that's come from, and so on. So I think that both helping folks to, from the beginning, to understand this is what this space is going to be. Can we agree to operate in this way? What that means is who's responsible for holding us accountable? We all are. So if we come up against a moment, then you as participants get to say, so I'm not experiencing you as holding both perspectives, right? And considering that, yeah.
Jamie, one of the things that you were getting at kind of at the end there, and something that I remember very distinctly from being a participant in your space, is like I think almost all facilitators probably do some version of ground rules or group norms or intention setting or something at the beginning, right? And as you said, like, it's so important to set that. And I remember feeling very like moved, like there was so much in your intro of that. Like there's so much energy and intention and like calling in and getting people to, but we didn't build them together, right? Like you had your set, but there was so much that you did to facilitate like kind of buy-in and expectation setting right in that first 5 minutes. I'm wondering if you can speak to like your process around that.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. And generally for me, so depending upon the kind of space that I'm in, right? So if I've got a week, right? Or 4 days or 3 days with you, then the process of developing norms for learning can look different, right? What I've learned over the last 30 or so years, that the list kind of looked like this, right? That's pretty much what's coming up. And so what's important to me is that we get some agreement and some buy-in around why this matters, and then invite folks to say if there's anything that they need to add, right? Or something that doesn't feel reflected up there for them, so that they can have that space. And I appreciate that you raised, Meg, that often I go in with that ready as partially to set the tone for, so these are things that I know that we're going to need to have happen if we're going to do this work. And just kind of to invite people into that, right? And I am glad that you said that the energy that I put forth in that is noticeable, because I have often experienced it as perfunctory in people's engagement. So here are the ground rules, or here are the learning norms, and we say these 5 things. Can we all agree to that? And then we just move on without recognition that why do we even create those, right? We create those because what we know is this is not the way we normally operate. We aren't normally open and honest. We don't listen well. We don't trust intent. We don't prepare for conflict and discomfort. That's not the way we normally are. So what we're doing as we set this up is we're setting up a counterculture experience. This is an experience that is pushing against the grain, and we must be intentional and conscious and deliberate about creating that. And so the time that I spend everywhere all the time is around that, is about then helping folks to be able to hold the both and to pay attention. Now, again, as I say all this, some folks might argue that you are setting up an environment so it is comfortable for dominant group members, right? Some of that comes up as we do learning organization or learning community agreements. So like this is just white space or space for the straight people not to feel uncomfortable and all that. As a facilitator, you must be able to hold that as a perspective, right? So, yep, that can absolutely be what it might feel like. And we also know it is important for us to build our capacity to be in the conversation so the learning can happen. The stuff that gets in the way of our being able to do that is often because we are not practicing these things. So the intention of this is not to make the environment safer for dominant group. The intention in this is for us all to be more effective at engaging in deeper and more authentic conversation, right? And we are inviting you to try that on. That's what we're inviting you to do, right? So, but not be shut down by what can feel like, for some, we're trying to create a safe space, not a brave space.
Yeah.
Right? And that dynamic is very present today.
Yeah, and Jamie, that makes me think about the so the both and or just this idea of like whatever norm you set in this space, and as a facilitator, you have a lot of choices in what you choose to like allow to thrive in a facilitation versus what you just like shut down. And multiple truths, when one person is bringing their truth that is an oppressive truth and somebody else is bringing their truth that's an anti-oppressive truth, I think that a lot of facilitators struggle with holding both of those equally. They're totally going to be on board with holding multiple truths if they're anti-oppressive. But if somebody says, as an example, and I heard this recently in a workshop, is for me, there just are two genders. That's just it. There are only two genders. And it's really important for me that like for me and my family, and like that's just how it is. Right. And then if somebody else were to say, no, there are more than two genders. And for me, that's really important. I think for a social justice facilitator, it's easier to hold one of those truths, right? Like it's easier to create space for the anti-oppressive truth. How might you respond in that setting? Sure. And what advice would you have for other people?
Yeah. Well, so what comes up for me, Sam, is actually it's quite easy for me to hold both of those.
Yeah.
And it's easy for me to hold both of those because both of them come from somewhere. So as that person is saying and that's what I need to be for me and my family. So then I want to explore more with that person, right? Again, I think that some of the challenge for us is as if we feel like is that we often feel like people sprung forth full grown, like they just kind of woke up and they came into the room today with these oppressive attitudes and ideas.
Yeah,
they came from somewhere, right? They were born, they were raised in spaces, and people told them stuff, right? And people who mattered to them told them stuff, and it seemed like it was important because they were good people, their parents, their grandparents, their teachers, their pastors, their rabbis, their priests, whatever. Well, why would they lie to me, right? So I don't think that they would lie to me. So this must be true, and you all must be saying, you all must be off, or you're wrong. So, all right, let me just be with you in your socialization, right? Because you've got this misinformation, bias history. It is not your fault, nor is it your parents' fault, because they got it too, right? And so our ability to hold that it's come from somewhere, right? And so at the end of the day, what I'm often trying to help folks understand first is, are you willing to walk with people on their journey, right? Are you willing to be with them? Because the other thing for us as facilitators is our work is to see ourselves in the person. So when have I said something like that?
Yeah.
Where do I believe something like that? Maybe it's not around gender identity or gender and maybe it was been around race. Maybe it's been around class, right? And maybe I've just been so immersed in this so long I can't remember when I didn't know, right? Because I feel like I never said anything like that. I don't know how you always do. Lucky you to have not been raised with any oppression, right? I don't know where that comes from. But I know that I've been there.
Yeah.
I've absolutely been there around religion. Absolutely. And when I heard you make that statement, I took myself right to myself in a religious place as a dominant group member around religion, and I would have absolutely been saying the exact same thing, right? So I remember the same thing around some gender stuff that I had, that men was this and women were that, and so on and so on. So I have been there, and I can see how people could be there. Not that I want them to stay there, but if I'm making them wrong for being there, it's not likely that I'm going to help them move from there.
Yeah.
Right? So the work of facilitation, particularly as it relates to, but I think this works in lots of areas, but particularly as it relates to the social justice stuff, is our ability to remember what it was like before we knew, right?
Yeah.
We didn't always know there was more than two genders. I know I didn't. How would I have known that, right? Right? So I didn't, and even if, just like I didn't always know that it was, that people who might connect to folks who were assigned the same gender or assigned the same sex as them as birth, so who might identify as gay or lesbian. I didn't always know that that was okay. Like I had my time when I didn't, because of what I was taught, I didn't think that was okay. I didn't think that was natural, right? That was some kind of problematic thing that came as a result of abuse, or came as a result of sin, right? Those were the things that would have come out of my mouth. But then there was some learning.
Yeah.
And some people who stayed with me in my not knowing long enough to help me understand what I didn't know.
Yeah, I appreciate the response so much, Jamie, because I think, well, first of all, we didn't even know there was gender, let alone or more, right? Like we were taught that there was gender. And I asked this, I don't know, Meg, if you want to follow this up, but I ask it from a very particular place. And I think Meg knows, because we've talked about this a lot. Meg, do you have a follow-up for that, or is it okay if I ask one?
You can go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, that doesn't seem to be that is not necessarily the popular response to that comment from a social justice facilitator standpoint. And maybe if it's unpopular, I think more important than that is that's a scary way to be as a social justice facilitator. It takes a lot of vulnerability, I think, in a kind of an odd way, right? To reach out and to walk with that person. Who's holding an oppressive belief. That's a risky, it feels socially risky in a justice facilitation to do that as the facilitator. Right. How do you, and I love that you were like, it's not hard for me. And for me, it's not hard either, but I don't know how to help other people get to that point. And you've been doing this for a while, and you've helped a lot of people, I'm sure, get to that point. Have you seen things that have helped other people be able to take that leap of through that fear, to be able to stand next to that person and dig into their socialization, not in a way that demonizes them, but in a way that will hopefully help them work through it?
Yeah, and I think that some of it is about helping us to be in space to slow down, right? To slow us down, and to honor our humanities. And again, folks, this is my deeply held belief. I don't believe that we are inherently issed. Like, I don't believe being born white makes you a racist, right? It's not a biological, physiological thing, right? Being born male makes you sexist, or cisgender makes you, transphobic. It doesn't mean that at my core. I don't believe that at my core. I do believe that oppression is real. It's alive and well, and it's about power and privilege and access and maintaining, right, the status quo. And if we are to shift that, right, then it is our work to then kind of peel back those layers, right? The challenge sometimes, and I think that one of the powers of the Social Justice Training Institute is that we invite folks into a space to immerse them in a social identity, and then pull them out of that to help them to see how the dynamics of oppression play out across those across identities and at intersections. And so at the Social Justice Training Institute, we do race, and we immerse folks in looking at how race shows up. And it is our hope that in that space that as white folks are really honing in on how dominance around race manifests in their ideologies, in their thoughts, in their behaviors, in their practices, and so on and so forth, that they can get and see some of that and how that shows up in other dominant identities that they have, and that they can see from their minoritized or marginalized identities, and do some learning from the people of color in terms of what they experience in that space, and that people of color can do the vice versa, right? So that people of color can see how the dynamics of minoritization and marginalization show up in terms of the way we treat each other, what we see and expect from dominant group members, and so on and so forth. And so that interacts across that, but also that they can see how those things play out in other minoritized spaces, but how they show up like white people in the space based upon their privileged and dominant identities. So I said all that to say is it really is about our opportunity to see ourselves in each other. When am I and where am I like that? Where was I like that? And what was my journey to knowing and to understanding? And for me, the role of facilitator, it's facilitator, educator, right? So one of my mentors said to me back in the early days, so we were doing a workshop, and some white guys in the room. It was a workshop. It was the 5-day institute around race and all that kind of stuff. And we were doing it, and some of the white guys in the room had said something, and they pissed me off. I was gone. And I'm facilitating, right? Okay. And I start in. I just go in on them. So they were saying anti-racist stuff, and I just go in. So we have a break, and Joan comes to me, and this is one of my favorite lines. This is my favorite teaching. I do this all the time when I'm working with facilitators. Joan, at break, she just checks in. She says, "How you doing, Jamie?" I said, "Oh, I'm good. I'm good." Like, and so my back is kind of up now, right? Because Joan's a white woman. I'm like, "What you about to say?" Right? Because I'm about to take you out too, just like I took you out. So that's where I'm at, right? I'm like, what? So he was kind of a little harsh, a little hard in there on the guys right there at that part. And then I started in on her. It's like, well, I'm not gonna have white people telling me how I can feel and how I can show up in my field. And she just took a deep breath. And she said beautifully, "So Jamie, you can't invite people to show up in an authentic way and share their truth and then beat them up for doing it." Oops. Ooh, that would not be my role. So particularly the role of the facilitator. If a member of the group does that, then you get to manage that, but absolutely not in your role as facilitator. That's why in SJTI we work with people to heal from your triggers. Because it is often those triggering moments, those things that caught you off guard, that have you show up in a fight or flight response. So you might take them out or shut down, right? And so facilitators really have to do the work, their work, again, back to particularly around social justice and diversity and inclusion facilitation, so that they can show up in a space that really is about holding it and not about working out their own stuff on the participants.
Yeah.
Jamie, me and Sam couldn't agree more on that. And I think that we really do see like a unique responsibility of the facilitator, right? That like when you're a participant, like there's a whole other set of games.
That's right.
A whole other set of rules, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
So, like managing your triggers is one of those things, is like a unique responsibility of a facilitator. Is there, if somebody was like, you know, they had gone to a lot of workshops, but they were just starting to be like, I really want to be in the front of the room, I want to start facilitating. Are there things that you're like, okay, this is, you got to know that like as a participant, this is okay. As a facilitator, this is not okay.
Yes.
Or like you have a different, anything else come to mind beyond the like managing your triggers?
Yes. So the first thing that I think is important is that we hold the knowing that our role is to hold the space for everyone, not just the ones who see it the way we see it, right? And so that you and so when I say hold that, I mean that you really have to do your work to not be at an unconscious level really wishing they would just fall into the river and die. Because that will slip out in your energy, right? And it might slip out in not calling on them. It might slip out in the way you allow others to take them out, right? As opposed to, you know, kind of call them into, no. And again, it is not about expecting the room or the participants to have to be taken care of, dominant group, not at all, right? But it is also about creating a space where you don't get to dehumanize people, right? You get to name what's real, what's painful, what's hard, but we are not creating a space where it's okay to abuse folks. And again, I can often hear, well, minoritized folks are experiencing violence and abuse and all those things every day. Yep. And this is not a space in which we're going to allow that to happen. So it's not going to happen to you, and it's not going to happen to someone else, right? And so in this space, the space of facilitation and learning and engagement, that the work is to create the space so that we can all leave here better, right? And that's not saying it's going to be all comfortable and nice and you can't swear and cuss and then all you can't say, and that's not what I'm saying. I am saying that that we recognize people's humanity, and that we hold that. Now, again, as I said, that's my core value. Again, like, and it is for me. I'm in any facilitative space that I'm in. One of my cores is to do no harm, right? That doesn't mean I won't say something or might have an impact. It's not the way I intended, but I'm not about creating more hurt or adding more harm to the world. And when in the role to lead and facilitate that, it is my responsibility to kind of hold that, right? So that's one thing. I think the other piece for me is that it is important to know kind of where you are, how you doing. Like, am I even in a space to be in this today? And if I'm not, so what do I need to do to get clearer, to check in with myself, especially if I'm facilitating alone, because that's the big deal. So I need to pay attention to, so what's the narrative that's in me as I walk into this group, right? And so is my armor on? Is my shield up? You know, And, you know, I think that I go in, depending upon, you know, how tired I am or whatever, knowing that I need to take a deep breath so I can be here in my full presence, right? But I tend not to walk in the spaces armed, right? Because that's, I'm coming in prepared for a fight with folks. So I'm not coming in armed, I'm coming in prepared, right? And I might be prepared to deal with resistance. There's going to be some resistance in the space today. And so it's not going to be a facilitated conversation where everybody's in alignment. And if I'm inviting them at the beginning to name pronouns, I'm going to know that context, that 70% of them not going to know what a pronoun is. And then those who do, another 10 who know what a pronoun is, they may know but not know why we need to say them, right? And so they're stumbling over that. And then, okay, so that's the context of this space. So I'm prepared for that. And so then I'm prepared to engage that and help folks to talk about why that matters and so on and so forth. So where am I? What's the narrative that I'm carrying about the people that I'm coming into the room with? And how is that? What I had said earlier that I did want to definitely speak to is working with the co. And that I don't want folks to minimize the importance of doing the pre-work when you're working with a co-facilitator in these conversations, particularly in diversity and inclusion and social justice conversations, because your shit gonna show up. Whoops, can I say that?
It's okay.
It is going to show up.
Yeah.
So I don't care how much work you've done, doing it with another person, the environment simply pulls in the dynamics, right? So gender is going to show up. Race is going to show up. Age is going to show up. Level, experience is going to show up. If you talk about it, if you prepare as you go into the space, then you are more likely to effectively navigate as the dynamics of difference show up. But if you don't do that, it is very easy for you to slip into stuff and things begin to show up and leak out and all of those things. Yeah. So those are working with the co is pre-work is important. And I know, and I see this all the time. People are paired to facilitate the conversation after orientation, right? So a faculty member and a new student or a student leader, or the people are paired in those kinds of ways. And they've done nothing. They've gotten the guide. They got the facility. Here are the questions you need to ask. Then, you know, these are the things that we need. And here we go. We've not prepared. And then our identities show up at the session. So we start talking over each other. We start skipping over each other. We start repeating each other's stuff. We start cutting each other off. We start and then one person is having an attitude. They've been caught some feelings about it, but they're not saying nothing. And it's all there. How do you want to be referred to? How do you want to be interrupted? Do you want to be interrupted? Is it okay for me to add on after you? Is it not okay? What's the impact of my doing that? Are you going to do that after I say something, right? Or are we going to do a plan to invite each other in if after we say something? So, you know, lots of time I work with facilitation and somebody's doing something, a partner's doing something, and they say, "Any ads, Jamie?" Right? And so, and then I say, "Oh, well, yeah, here's this," or no, or then I get up and I do my part and I don't say any ads. I don't want no ads from you, and that's from you. And so then what's that dynamic, right? So who asks for ads and who's not asking for ads? And what does that mean? And if I assume that it's just collaborative to ask for ads at the end, but we haven't talked about that, and that's not your style because you're used to working alone and all that kind of stuff, it matters. It matters, and it'll show up.
It does. And Jeannie, so I think that social justice facilitators are uniquely prepared to have that pre-work conversation, right? Like there's, if you're a person who's engaging in social justice dialogues and that's like your world, then getting into that beforehand with the co-facilitator in helpful ways, right? Constructive ways, in ways that aren't crossing boundaries, all of that, it's going to be much easier. So what how would you explain, or like what advice would you have for somebody who's not a social justice facilitator but does engage in co-facilitation to do pre-work in a way that doesn't force their co-facilitator to show up in unhealthy ways, put them in harmful situations, or create unhelpful power dynamics that that person might not be as in tuned to understand because they don't study that stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that so I do leadership. It's another space that I do, and we do co-leaders, right? Co-facilitation. And while leadership certainly has a core value of creating a better, just and thriving world, and it's a leadership institute, not necessarily a social justice institute, right? Okay. And so lots of the folks who come to leadership don't necessarily come as social justice facilitators or with the social justice lens. And so what leadership has done in a beautiful way is help folks to understand the co-facilitator, the co-lead relationship and how that matters, and help prepare very strategically what are things that you need to engage before you begin to lead a group of people together. Much of that, some of that stuff is around identities and how identities will matter. But other things are just basic, important facilitation things that will play out across identities, right? So maybe you don't do talks about race or gender or that kind of stuff well, but in facilitation, you need to know what interruption looks like. You need to know what talking over looks like. You need to know what asking, are there any ads looks like. You need to know what it feels like, or what should happen when it doesn't seem like the room is getting my instructions. Do you repeat my instructions? Do you say, will you all just be quiet and listen? Right. And so what's the dynamics that show up in that? And so an understanding about that, an understanding about what happens when you deliver certain content and I facilitate the dialogues, right? And what's the implications of the content heavy stuff or the information stuff coming from you, and all of the lighter stuff, what might get experienced as fluff, coming from me, right? So those are just basic, and when I say just basic, I don't mean the just in that,
foundational,
but foundational understandings about co-facilitation and how that they can make or break an experience, because the people are watching that as well,
right?
And that is a part of the experience for them. Yeah.
Jamie, you're, as you said at the beginning, like 30 years deep in facilitation.
Okay.
And one thing I'm wondering is, and I don't know if this happens for you, but if you were to work with somebody who was at a very different experience level than you, like they've got 5 years or 2 years of facilitation under their belt, and you were to be like, okay, we're going to co-lead, this training, or how would you approach that? Like knowing 30 years deep of what you know, and knowing that they don't have all of that experience. Sure. Are there any particular ways you would pre-work, or any particular ways that you would want to navigate that in the room, just to, I guess, pick out a experience as an identity?
Right. Well, and I think I appreciate that, because I find myself in those spaces a great deal, because I put myself in other spaces, because I want to work with the next generation of facilitators and leaders. And I want to have them be able to learn from my experience, but also for me to be able to learn from them, right? So I think that there is something about the 5 and the 6 year person that I can learn from, that they're bringing a level of engagement, a level of knowing, a level of connection or way of connecting that might be different than me. So my pre-work is about both of us matter in this space, and both of us will bring skills and strengths to the space. The other part of that is the dynamics of age are real. The dynamics of experience are real. And I know that given not only my experience, but my name and my reputation, what that can feel like in a room, right? So lots of folks who facilitate with me for the first, second time, and this happened in the last conference, they feel intimidated. And some of that is about not wanting to disappoint, right? So that's a conversation that I have, right? In terms of, as we prepare for this, not wanting to disappoint me, and sometimes that manifests in ways that it looks like they're asking me for feedback at every moment. Okay, so we just had them turn and say good morning to someone. How did I do? Did I do that? Okay, was that all right? What should I do? Right? And I am present with the realities of age and the realities of experience. So I am operating in that space, supporting and leading, them along. And I think that is an important role for us to recognize when we're working with new facilities, just like if we were working with an RA or anybody who doesn't have the experience, and we're trying to help them along and to support them. We know that some of it is about being there to hold them and support them if something happens. You don't try to leave them out there by themselves, but trust that their way is going to be fine. One of the things that I say that seasoned facilitators also have to understand is, yeah, you might have said it in that way, but like the room didn't burn down, and people got what they needed to get. And so you might have said, well, they missed saying it in this way, or they needed to say these words. Is the need to have them say it the way that you would have said it worth the impact that it will have for you to talk over, to interrupt, or to come behind them in terms of their own skills, the credibility that they have in the room, and then the focus shifting to you being the one who knows everything and so on. And so it's always a kind of a juggling act and a balancing. Sometimes for me, what I end up being able to do is to say, if we've got a full day, then maybe at lunch we check in and say, okay, so this piece was, I thought, especially if I thought it was really important, like it's important to get that in, that missing piece mattered. Then I want to say, so we just want to figure out how to get that in the afternoon, right? Just figure out how we say it, and let them do that or get that in. And then if they say, well, I'd rather you do that, that's not as much in me, because that's why I missed it. Then fine, we can go to that space. But that part of the ways I think that dominance shows up is that you have to do it when you want to do it.
Right.
Like it's like I gotta interrupt this program for an important announcement for me, right? No, how about just wait? Maybe they'll get to it in the statement, and they're just going in it and at it in a different way than you would have, but it's going to get there. And that has honestly been a real lesson for me. Not only one who's been in it for a while, but that's some of my gendered stuff or some of my sex stuff as a male that I have. And I say gendered and sex because I believe that that's where the teaching comes from for me around having the final say. That's very masculine for me, or male for me.
Right.
So I show up in that, and I can easily slip into that if I'm not conscious.
What's something you think that social justice facilitators do really well that other facilitators could really benefit from? And what tips would you have for those facilitators if they want to try to use that tool in their workshops?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I think that social justice educators do really well is they allow identities to matter.
Yeah.
And they are more comfortable with how identities will show up in informed spaces, both with them as facilitators as well as the participants in the space. I think that social justice facilitators are more, not always great, but they are better at being okay with not that you will get this, but we will have done this, right? So I think that I experience more and more today, social justice facilitators being confident and comfortable with the flow and not the agenda, right? So that, all right, so here's where we were going. This is what our intentions were. And we do have intentions, right? So we're intending to cover this material, but we are in a facilitative, organic learning process. And if I'm not trying to get you prepared to pass a test, right? But helping you to build your capacity to be engaged yourself and others across difference and so on and so forth. And I recognize, yes, there are some skill-based things that you need to know and understand, but I have no illusion that this 3-hour, 5-hour, 2-day experience is going to get you there. I mean, completely there, right? Because there's no, what it will do is get you the practice in the things that you will need to get there, right? And if we can have some real deep and honest learning in the space that's about what's happening real time, that's going to do far more than any PowerPoint slide. So I think that many social justice educators are more comfortable with that. And I see that sometimes as I'm doing leadership development or leadership training with folks who really come from more of a leadership training background than a kind of a social justice background. And so when you can put those two together, leadership folks can have an agenda and operate in that way. And I'm not saying that's true for all of them or any of that kind of stuff, but here are the 5 habits of successful people, then we got to get you through all of those before. And so that's a mindset and a way of being that's different than so those who do social justice can come with.
Totally. And I think I appreciate that. And I think that's something I've gotten more comfortable with, is the flow, not the agenda. And I think that's something that's a powerful place to get to.
Well, and what you just said, man, as I heard you say that, what I said earlier, that's a counter narrative, right? And it's counterculture, because what the dominant culture supports is the agenda.
Learning outcomes.
That's right, exactly. That's it. So these are the things. And so when you show up as facilitators of social justice work, you have to be confident in your knowing that, no, this is the way to do this, right? And not be distracted or dissuaded by people who are saying to you, we didn't get to the strategic plan, though. Right? Right. So we had a full day of doing this conversation, and we just talked, right? And we don't have the end. We need to know what we have to do. And so there is a facilitation of a strategic plan discussion. That's different, right? Sure. And again, what's the intended outcomes of the space? What am I invited here to do? And sometimes we're trying to go, as I said, to the content too fast, because the context is, I don't like these people. And so you're trying to get me to talk to them, and I don't like them. You got to get through that. The boss made us come to this. You got to get through that. You can't just jump to the strategic plan when that's the context that you're operating in, right? Particularly through the lens of diversity and inclusion.
So, Jamie, the time has flown by for me, and we have one final segment to get to. Sam, are you good to?
I just want to ask one more question before you do that. Yeah, Jamie, I really do think that, so I wouldn't have thought of the identities thing as being something that social justice educators do, because it's just so obvious to me. And it's so obvious I didn't even think about it, right? And it's so obvious to other facilitators that identities don't matter, right? Like to leadership facilitators, oh no, this isn't about men. It's not about white people, outdoor educators. This isn't about sexuality, right? I just wonder, like, if you just, because we are close to end of time, but like if you have like one like for anybody who doesn't think identities matter, just like one thing that might get them thinking about it, or for them to internally process, any facilitator, for why identities and holding space for that in their facilitation could be helpful, I would really appreciate it.
So I just invite anyone who doesn't think that identities matter to really pay attention to what informs how they go into the room, right? So what are you thinking about based upon who you're going in to speak with, right? What and anything. So anything like that. So what do you think about as you go in? Well, I'm going in to speak to this group, so I need to dress this way.
Yeah.
Well, that's identity connected, right? So I think I'm speaking to the fraternity guys, or I'm going in to speak to sorority women, or I'm going in to speak to faculty, right? That's identity, right? That matters, right? So you might want to take social identities out of it, but you can hold roles, right? And how does that show up different if you then intersect what our social identities are, because those are in the room as well, and often creating noises and barriers or blocks or openings for folks, depending upon who you are and so on. Who do you feel comfortable going in to speak to, and who do you not feel as comfortable going in to speak to? So those are the kinds of questions to ask. Is like, oh, that's because I'm A. And I don't think people hear me as, you know, I go in and I'm going to speak to faculty and I feel less comfortable because I don't have a PhD. That's an identity, right? And so to help folks say, yeah, it does matter, and it's in the room, and it does matter because, you know, sometimes faculty aren't going to hear you in the same way. And so what does that mean I get to do with that? And how do I, and that doesn't mean I can't be effective and that I'm not effective and that I don't know enough, but it's about how they hold education, and then who can have knowledge and who can offer us stuff. So
I appreciate that, and I think that's a really helpful approach to is in the questions. So okay, so our last segment here, Jamie, is we have a couple of questions that we ask all of our facilitator guests. And the reason that we ask everybody is because we think that everyone has different ideas around these, but also kind of our vision for these is maybe one day we'll create a video where it says like, here's the question, and then we'll have a bunch of different people.
Sure, very nice.
So we won't ask any follow-up questions. And just knowing that context of how we might use it, that might inform the way you answer it. Sure. So we've got a couple questions here, and we'll just kind of go through them and get your thoughts. So the first one is, what are 3 words that you would use to describe facilitation?
Engage, holder, so I just used words that I would use to describe a facilitator.
Okay.
I think so. I think that I would say that facilitation is, yeah. So 3, because in 3 words, it's engager, a holder, and a presence. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. If you could pick one ground rule or group norm to apply to the entire world that everyone in the world would have to follow, what would it be?
Prepare to deal with conflict and discomfort.
Nice.
Great. Okay. What is something you still need to be reminded of as a facilitator?
We all are doing the best we can most of the time.
What do you do right before a facilitation?
I meditate and pray. so that I can be open to whatever is being channeled through me, and we co-create in the room.
What do you do right after?
Drink.
I don't know why I thought that's so funny.
It depends on the session. So this laughter that gets created is exactly what it's about for me, though. I go to find celebration. So whether it is I sit, I relax, and I have a drink, and I call somebody and I laugh with them, or I look at something fun on video, but afterwards I just breathe. And what I don't do is I don't read evaluations right after the session. That is an absolute no-no for me, because I don't want to be drawn into the possibility that two people had a problem, and then that takes my energy. I do read the evaluations later, but I walk away from the space grounded in, so how did I feel like I did that day? Because regardless of whether I got it all right, I know I did the best I could, because I don't show up in a room trying to mess up. So I know I did the best I could, so I just celebrate me at the end of it, and then I get to, so how would you do it differently the next time, the next day, but not when I've poured all of myself out to a group of people. No, I don't do it then.
I like that. Thank you. What's a piece of facilitation advice you would like to give your 5 years ago self?
Drink more. No. My 5 years ago self. What would I have done? That it really is important for you to continue to trust your knowing that as you do this work, the skills and the abilities that's needed to kind of heal the planet, to help us to get to a more socially just and inclusive space are exactly what you're trying to help people get. Trust your knowing. Don't be distracted by folks who feel like dialogue, engagement, compassion, capacity building isn't necessary. Don't get distracted by the strategic plan, right? Because folks can't do the work of the strategic plan unless they're in good relationships with one another. So trust your knowing.
Right. What still stresses you out as a facilitator?
Ooh, this is a good one. And I got an answer. What stresses me out? It doesn't take me under, but it does just like give me like when folks don't know why they have me in the room. And I'm not talking about the participants. Yeah. I'm talking about the people who invited me. So when there is not leadership or the sponsor's ability to talk about why we're in here and why this matters, that is just additional heavy lifting that really is problematic, especially after I've talked to you about that, right? So in my preparation, I say, so here's what I need the senior leader to do, right? Or whoever's inviting me. Here's what I need you to do to be clear about setting the tone and the context and why this matters, right? And then, sometimes they say, well, I'm going to need some coaching around that, or they're going to need some coaching around that. Okay, let's schedule the call to have the coaching, and we do the coaching call, and then they're nothing, right? And so that then really does feel like this is a checklist, this is a setup. And I think it's particularly the case when you're doing work around creating greater campus inclusion and social justice and those kinds of things. But I think it can be the case with anything you're facilitating where it's a culture change dynamic. So if you're trying to facilitate culture change around your process, around the curriculum or anything like that, and that you haven't prepared the people through those who've invited you or the leadership with why, because facilitators are often brought in from the outside, right? So even if it's on your own campus, it's the facilitator from this center, right? Or from this space is coming in to help us to do this. And why is that? And folks not setting the context just gripes my butt.
Yep.
What do you do to manage the stress?
Drink. No, so you know what? I'm gonna stop saying that because I don't want people to think that I have a drinking problem. I really don't.
Okay, we'll edit it later.
I really don't.
Oh, but it's fun.
Right? Okay. But again, it goes back to laughter for me.
Yeah.
I just love to laugh and to play, right? So, what I do to manage the stress is I don't take it too seriously, right? Mm-hmm. I think that the work we do matters and it is important. And in order for me to stay in it, I have to be mindful of taking care of myself. So I realize, so part of what I do to manage is to be in the flow and not the agenda. Sometimes I'm in a room and this is what we were trying to get to, but there was too much stuff in the room to even get to half of this. And I did the best I could with what I had. And so I don't do a whole lot of judgment or beating up of self or second guessing self. Again, I get to reflect and say that well, here's what I might try in the next space or whatever, but I just relax. I get with folks, I get with my partner and we laugh and we talk about what our day was. He as well is a facilitator and organizational change person. And so we talk about our day. We hold people, we laugh at people as the same way that we hold them in love and light. So we allow ourselves to be in that space. Because what we know is that laughter is about the healing and not about judgment. It's not about us putting anybody down or out in that way. So, and then in the summertime, if I'm heading to the airport and I pass an ice cream place, I must get ice cream.
Okay. Noted. So what is a unique place you facilitated?
Well, the first place that popped into my mind was at the graduate school in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. For me, that was a particular place where there was a deep learning around context before content. And there were some things that I had not considered about the context of coming from the US to do this teaching. And it showed up very much because my content was very US centric and I made some assumptions. And after the first day of the session, it's like, you need to slow this down and recognize and engage this context differently. Yeah. But it was wonderful. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Yeah.
What is a not directly facilitation related experience that you think every facilitator should have?
The Landmark Forum. It's an experience. It's a 3 to 5 day experience that helps you to explore your knowing and yourself, and the way that you make meaning. And I have found members of my community who have experienced the Landmark Forum, who are facilitators, to show up with a special something. Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. Yeah. What book do you recommend most to others?
I don't recommend a lot of books to others. So when I think about facilitating and training, I think that there are some really helpful things, regardless of what you facilitate. But in the teaching for social justice, there is just some good stuff around facilitation that's in there, and then some really good stuff, particularly content related, around doing social justice facilitation. So it is the textbook for the Institute. So absolutely.
Jimmy, do you have any online resources either that you've created or that you like visiting that you think others should check out?
Not as it relates to facilitation specifically. I do find myself utilizing TED Talks, YouTube, Google is my friend, to just help me just look at stuff, just to find stuff and to listen to stuff and to see kind of what's out there. So I'm a fan of type in this word and see what comes up, and then see what you, because there's some really good stuff. People have done some great work out there, and I like to share people's good work. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Cool.
One piece of advice you have for everyone who's listening.
So facilitators, piece of advice is to recognize the importance of inquiry, and that asking good questions is far more powerful than having all the answers. And what we get to do as facilitators is invite people into a deeper sense of knowing. And that happens when they can discover things because you've just asked the good questions. So look at ways that you can continue to do that, not only of others, but of yourself, because that will help you be a more effective facilitator as well.
Great. Jamie, thank you so much. That was our last question. For folks who are curious to look into the links or any of the other things mentioned, we'll put them in the description of the video. Jamie, if you have any links that you want to send to us or ways that people can find you or contact you, we'll include those in the description as well. But thank you so much for your time. This was a tremendous conversation, and I can't thank you enough for it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I enjoyed it so much. It was easy. It was fun. Thank you. Appreciate you both.
Good. Appreciate that. Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.